Well, good afternoon to everyone and welcome to our Food Matters webinar on type 1 diabetes. This is the third one in the series that we've been running at SVI, and it's a very big welcome to all of you. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we find ourselves today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating in this webinar today. It's been so wonderful to see the guest list today, and so many of you are great friends of SVI, and we really welcome you to the seminar today. And also a very big welcome to people who this is your first time that you are attending one of these webinars, and it's just, I hope you enjoy it and it's wonderful. For those of you whom I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Karen Inge. I'm the chair of the SVI Foundation. And in my spare time, I'm an accredited practicing dietitian. But today's program is going to be wonderful. I think you'll find it very stimulating. It's going to be a presentation, as I mentioned before, on type 1 diabetes from our own Professor Tom Kay. And then I will be giving a little snapshot for 5 minutes just on some of the nutrition issues that are specific to type 1 diabetes. After the presentations, we will have a short Q&A where you will have the opportunity to write questions to Tom or myself. And there is a Q&A button on the bar at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to type your questions throughout the webinar. We will only be using the Q&A feature today rather than the chat or the raise your hand option. We'll certainly try and get to all your questions. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce someone who is incredibly well known to all of you, and that is Professor Tom Kay. Tom, as you know, is the director of SVI, or St Vincent's Institute of Medical Research, and holds a very active role in SVI's type 1 diabetes research group. As an endocrinologist and a clinical immunologist, he leads the Victorian node of the Australian Islet Transplant Consortium. And his research interests include a number of things, but certainly the immune mechanisms by which insulin-producing beta cells are destroyed in diabetes, and also work in pro-insulin specific immune tolerance. Professor Kay holds a number of honorary appointments. He's an honorary professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne, an honorary endocrinologist at St Vincent's Hospital here in Melbourne, and an honorary visiting professor at the Lee Kong Chan, we talked about how to pronounce this, School of Medicine at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Professor Kay has been a fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences since 2016, and he would absolutely dislike everything that we're saying about him because he's very humble, but I can see he's uncomfortable. So I'm going to stop there, but it's great. Thank you, Tom, very much for your presentation today, and it's over to you.
Thanks a lot, Karen, and welcome everybody, and thanks very much for joining in with these terrific seminars that Karen and Nicola have organised for us. I think they're a great initiative and a real opportunity during this time when we're all stuck at home. And I'm going to share my screen and jump right into my presentation because I've got a tendency to rabbit on, and I think we should get right into it. So hopefully, that's not the first slide. There we go. Hopefully you can all see my screen, and it shows some pancreatic islets that were, so the pancreatic islets were isolated by our islet transplant team, and the islets are the clusters of 1,000 cells or so that are scattered throughout the pancreas, an organ that sits just behind the stomach inside the abdomen. And what we do in the islet program is to purify these islets, which is where the insulin-producing cells are, to use for infusion into people with difficult to control type 1 diabetes as part of our islet transplant program, which has been running now for more than 10 years. Now, in this series called Food Matters, there's nothing more central to the intersection between food and medicine than these pancreatic islets. They really are the master regulators of the way that the body deals with food. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about that, about what it is that insulin actually does. And of course, most of us are familiar with the idea that insulin controls blood sugar or blood glucose, but what does that mean in more specific terms? So the way I would go about explaining that is that the meals that we all eat at various times during the day, we don't need those immediately as fuel for the body. Clearly, that's what food's all about. It's about providing fuel for the body. So as the nutrients come in this sort of lumpy way, we're not sort of infusing them throughout the day, we're having them as meals. The nutrients have to be removed from the bloodstream and stored for later when they'll be retrieved from the storage places. And the storage places typically are the liver and the muscle and the fat. And they need to be retrieved when we need them. And so then at that time, the nutrients, particularly glucose, are used not only for exercise, for example, in muscles to provide energy for exercise, but also all normal body functions. Just being awake and conscious, for example, requires a significant amount of energy use, particularly glucose. And these islets that you see in front of you, the pancreatic islets and the hormones they make, particularly insulin, the main hormone product of the pancreatic islets, and also glucagon, they carry out this complicated process of storing and retrieving fuels, nutrients in a remarkably exact way, so that in normal people without diabetes, the blood glucose rises only very slightly after a meal, barely budges, whereas in people with diabetes, it actually moves around quite a lot because either insulin is not there in sufficient amount to store the nutrients after a meal, or even if the insulin is there in adequate amounts, like in type 2 diabetes, that doesn't work adequately to carry out this vital function. And the metaphor I would use is that, or the simile is that this is quite similar to getting online shopping. And if there's one thing we're all familiar with, is the arrival of online shopping. Seems just to be handled so much more smoothly than it used to. You don't even have to go and sign anything. Someone just comes and drops things off at the front door. So if you get an online order of groceries arriving at home, food from the supermarket, you're not going to use them immediately. They need to be put away in the right place so that first of all, the corridor is clear of it doesn't pile up, deliveries don't pile up by the front door. But they need to be put in the right place so that they can be taken out later to prepare a meal when mealtime comes and people are hungry. And when that's not done appropriately, the corridor builds up with groceries all over the place that haven't been put away, food that might be in the wrong place, the milks and the ice creams melting and so on, and meals are not prepared at the right time. And that's really what insulin does when food is delivered through a meal. It puts stuff away ready for later use. In type 1 diabetes, when the insulin producing cells in the islets are destroyed by the immune system, there are problems with glucose building up in the bloodstream, the analogy with the corridor, and not being stored or used appropriately. For example, it might be if there's too much insulin around in type 1 diabetes, the food stuff, the glucose, is locked up in the tissues and is not available in the right amounts for vital tissues like the brain to use it. And this dysregulation of blood glucose in the absence of insulin was lethal until 1922, when insulin was first purified at the University of Toronto from calf liver by Bandit and Best, and for which the Nobel Prize was subsequently awarded to Banting and Charles McLeod, the head of the department that they were working in. Best, who was a medical student at the time, got left out of that award. And on this slide, you can see the first person in Australia to be given to receive insulin, who received insulin at the end of 1922. when her father had written to Banting in Toronto, his daughter was desperately ill with type 1 diabetes. As I said, it was uniformly lethal up until that time, and Banting sent insulin by ship, and Phyllis Adams then lived until the mid-1990s. So that was a remarkable success story. So the amazing thing about insulin treatment for type 1 diabetes is, if we fast forward to the 21st century, is that young people with type 1 diabetes, the treatment is pretty much the same in essence as it was nearly 100 years ago. It's of course become far more sophisticated, but it still depends on the use of insulin as a hormone replacement therapy when the disease process is finished and all the insulin producing cells in those pancreatic islets that I showed you have been destroyed. Once that happens, insulin is then given back as a lifelong necessity, and that's given back in a complicated way where it has to balance the blood glucose level, which is measured in ever increasingly sophisticated ways, and very importantly, balance the amount of nutrients that are taken in, just like to mimic the way the body would do normally, and perhaps we'll discuss that a bit more later with Karen, and also balance the requirements of exercise, for example. So it's a complicated and burdensome treatment that doesn't always necessarily work out exactly right, and that can result in complications of type 1 diabetes, which we're all familiar with, and particularly affecting the kidney and the eyes and the nerves, and it can also result in premature mortality. Now, the life expectancy for someone with type 1 diabetes in this era is very good, but it's still about a decade shorter than the life expectancy for someone without diabetes. And I must say, I think it's a remarkable thing that treatment, the use of insulin for treatment of diabetes has lasted 100 years. It's hard to think of other treatments for major diseases that have remained in essence unchanged for that long a period of time. And it's a good thing to remember when we think, as we will in the rest of the talk, about some of the really sophisticated treatments for type 1 diabetes that are on the horizon. It's good to think about that the global situation for the treatment of diabetes is not so uniformly favourable as it is in a country like Australia, and there are many parts of the world in which supply of insulin and blood glucose testing, the very basics of insulin treatment, are not routinely available, and certainly not necessarily reimbursed by government and so on. And so it's just I think worth keeping that in perspective. And this is a slide taken from the work of Graham Ogle, who from Sydney, who's done a huge amount of work on diabetes in the developing world. So what do customers want in this environment? I think we're in this era, we're really all focused on being responsive to needs, clinical needs, the needs of people with being focused on the needs of people with diabetes and so on. And I think people with diabetes no doubt want a cure for diabetes and a break from the round-the-clock burden of disease that's safe and effective, and particularly a relief from the fear of the blood glucose dropping too low, which I talked about before, which is one of the main fears of people with type 1 diabetes, and is actually the main trigger for the use of islet transplantation. People have very difficult to control low blood glucose secondary to the use of insulin. Endocrinologists, of course, want better outcomes for their patients that are, again, safe and effective. Another factor here, though, is that the medical profession, and speaking as an endocrinologist, I'm about as much of an endocrinologist as Karen is a practicing dietitian. I think we've both spent many years doing those things, but I certainly am not in the front line of daily treatment of people with type 1 diabetes at this stage. But endocrinologists as a group are reasonably conservative, and they have been trained to administer insulin as the treatment for diabetes. So it's going to be our job to convince them that there are potentially treatments for type 1 diabetes that will either complement the use of, make the use of insulin more effective or potentially in the long haul completely replace the use of insulin for diabetes, but that's many years away at this stage. And the people who are responsible for paying for healthcare, they want better patient outcomes per healthcare dollar. That is, they're interested in understanding the health economics. They're not interested in providing a blank check. They want new treatments to provide value. Current treatment, as I said, is hormone replacement therapy. It's not directed at the pathological mechanisms, how the disease works. Diabetes is an immune system disease. There is no treatment for diabetes in routine clinical use at this time that targets those immune mechanisms. And it's true that many patients do not achieve the glycemic targets, the control of blood glucose targets that science would say, as medical science would say, is optimal, and that's true all around the world, and it's particularly true in adolescence when it's very difficult for kids going through adolescence, both because of the dynamic hormonal changes that can affect blood glucose levels, but also, of course, the behavioural changes of adolescence. Very difficult to achieve glycemic targets, and for this reason, complications remain a worrisome possibility, as does mortality. I mentioned before that I think the treatment for diabetes is tough, around the clock attention to detail about administration of insulin. And so the use of insulin, while life-saving, falls well short of a cure for type 1 diabetes. And in the future, we imagine there'll be new ways of providing treatment for type 1 diabetes, finding other ways to restore the body's ability to produce insulin itself, so it doesn't have to be administered by injection, and then also to abolish the immune disease that is causing destruction of insulin-producing cells. That is, to correct this mistake the body makes of having an autoimmune response against the pancreatic beta cells. Some of the up-to-date cutting-edge treatments in the meantime, while we're waiting for these treatments, include islet transplantation and also the use of very advanced technologies based on iPhone technology and so on, smartphone technologies that involve the use of computing to link blood glucose measurement and insulin delivery. Yeah, so the way forward over the next few years is particularly the use of fancy technology, which could be called automated insulin delivery, or the artificial pancreas, or closed loop systems. And these are devices that many people benefit from, where they have greater time in the normal range of blood glucose and fewer episodes where the blood glucose falls low and causes hypoglycemia. And new versions of these devices are coming out every year or two, just like updates in other technologies, phones and so on. There are iterative improvements in these devices. But there's a significant fraction of patients who don't, of people with diabetes, who either discontinue the use of devices or don't like using them. And reimbursement issues reimbursement is an issue in virtually all countries in which these devices are used. Pancreatic beta cell replacement, insulin producing cells using stem cell based technologies. This would be an update on the platform that's been built with islet transplant, is still definitely on the horizon, and new clinical trials of those technologies are starting with US-based biotechnology companies. And I think the sector is confident that this is the future in many ways, the ability to replace the body's ability to make insulin using stem cell-based therapies that might need protection from the immune system in various ways. And then the third issue is this idea of preventing and curing the autoimmune process that causes destruction of these insulin-producing cells, because doing something like that will be necessary to protect stem cells, beta cells, insulin-producing cells derived from stem cells, allow them to do their thing. Now, I want to talk briefly about prevention and cure of diabetes using ways of tackling the immune system. And this is just a slide which we don't need to go into details of, but it shows maybe I can use my laser pointer here to show that what it shows is in the background a way of thinking about diabetes. We think of the diagnosis of diabetes in young people with high blood glucose, so it's the main way of diagnosing it. It's being we now call that stage 3 type 1 diabetes. And we think of stage 1 and stage 2 type 1 diabetes as having already occurred in a pretty silent way, difficult to detect clinically, the stage in which the insulin producing cells are being destroyed in the body, leading up to not enough insulin producing cells being present to control the blood glucose. Now, groups around the world, including Australian groups, have participated in many clinical trials of immune therapies to try and prevent the continuing destruction of the insulin producing cells by the immune system. And some of the drugs that have been used are here on this slide. And there's been particular interest in this drug called teplizumab, which is a monoclonal antibody, an injected drug that has been used in both in stage 3 diabetes after the hyperglycemic develops, and also before that in the prevention of the development of diabetes. And it's shown significant promise, and there's a lot of interest and excitement in the idea that this might come into clinical practice. Another drug that's of great interest are the drugs that target this a molecule called TNF. Monoclonal antibodies against TNF are widely used for rheumatoid arthritis, and there's been some success with that also in stage 3 diabetes. But none of these drugs are yet in clinical practice for diabetes, and that's because of concern around whether they are sufficiently safe and whether they're sufficiently effective to make a good case for them being used in diabetes. Now, we're interested at St Vincent's in trying a new class of drug called the JAK inhibitors. These are drugs which are in clinical practice already for rheumatoid arthritis. For example, this drug, well, actually one of them is tofacitinib, is not shown, which is called Xeljanz, is not shown on this slide, but Olumiant or baricitinib, the drug that we're going to use in our clinical trial, is also on the market for rheumatoid arthritis. And these are drugs which have come into clinical practice just in the last 5 years or so, and have been tried in a variety of diseases, including rheumatoid and inflammatory bowel disease. For example, they're tablets, and they're proven to be pretty safe and pretty effective in those diseases. And we're interested in trying this drug to see if it can help in type 1 diabetes. And in the future, there are other drugs which might also be used. For example, there's a newly developed one of these JAK inhibitors, which is more specific for a certain group of target molecules and has a reduced number of side effects. So we're doing a clinical trial called the Bandit trial, and we hope to start that in the next few weeks with support from the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, both in the US and in Australia, and also the drug company Eli Lilly is providing us with the baricitinib for this trial, and we're going to treat people for a year with either baricitinib or placebo, and then look at the primarily look at whether the JAK inhibitor is able to preserve the amount of insulin described here as C-peptide. We don't need to go into detail of that, but whether the JAK inhibitor preserves the amount of insulin that's present in people with new onset type 1 diabetes. And of course, we'll always also be looking closely at safety and tolerability of the drugs, although they've been used very extensively in clinical trials in arthritis. So that's the exciting thing that's coming up in our world. We're really right on the cusp of starting the trial, a bit delayed because of COVID-19, but now looking like it's very much ready to
Hello. We've just had a slight technical problem, so we will attempt to fix that as soon as possible, but I think Tom had almost finished his presentation. So I might continue and take the opportunity to start with my presentation, and then we will go back to questions. So I'll just share my screen and we'll start on that. Thank you. So obviously, as Tom mentioned, food really matters with type 1 diabetes. I mean, it's terribly important that everybody still eats, of course, and what we eat can certainly make a difference to how everything that we do, of course. But the game changers, as Tom mentioned, have been the advances in technology, and to have these continuous glucose monitoring devices and also the insulin pumps has resulted in enormous flexibility with people's eating habits. And even though I'm only a very part-time dietitian now, I managed to speak to several of my colleagues who are working specifically with patients with type 1 diabetes, and they said that these really have been the game changers. But then there have been some issues as well with having information overload, so to speak, and really being able to see the exact impact of what you eat on your blood glucose levels. And what we're seeing actually is sort of people going almost three ways really. And we're seeing this particularly with this carbphobia starting to sort of surge, I suppose. I mean, as a population, there are many people who are sort of delving into the low carb eating phenomenon, I suppose. And as you know, carbohydrates are probably the most controversial nutrient when we're talking about diabetes, whether it's type 2 or type 1, but particularly type 1. Should you eat more carbohydrate or less carbohydrate? And with the new technologies and advances in technology, some people are feeling they have more freedom for perhaps indulging in some of the more refined carbohydrates and sugary foods and being able to cope with that in terms of balancing insulin with their blood glucose control. But in fact, what we are seeing more of, particularly with parents who are looking after their children who have type 1 diabetes, is trying to achieve a fat line of blood glucose levels and therefore restricting the foods that are rich in carbohydrates. And whilst I think we would all agree that the sort of sugary, ultra-processed sweet foods with little or no nutritional value would not be a problem, but when we're talking about the nutrient-rich carbohydrate foods, which do provide us with more than just energy, but certainly energy for every single cell in our body, but help particularly with our brain function and muscle function, and really with every energy system in our body. And as you can see, if you were following a low carbohydrate diet, you would be relying very much on the green leafy vegetables and certainly berries, because these are all low carb foods. But you'd be missing out on all the wonderful, nutritious, high fiber foods like all your whole grains, legumes, lentils, starchy vegetables, and beautiful fruits. And these foods are not only energy sources, but they also provide valuable polyphenols and other phytochemicals, which are so important to help as anti-inflammatory agents. And also these foods are very significant sources of dietary fiber. And we're now beginning to understand that soluble, insoluble, resistant starch type fibers are very important for our gut microbiome. And it's interesting because when I wasn't actually actively practicing as a dietitian, many, many years ago, the treatment for people with type 1 diabetes was a low carbohydrate diet. We used to even weigh out the 5% carbohydrate vegetables, etc. And then we found that a lot of people were cutting out the carbs, but then substituting or eating more saturated fat and ending up in coronary care wards. But let me just show you what actually 50 grams of carbohydrate looks like, because one of the big issues is with following a low carbohydrate diet is how low do you go? And the clinical definition of a low carbohydrate diet is less than 135 grams of carbohydrate rich foods per day, or less than 25% of your total energy coming from carbohydrate. But my colleagues are telling me that children are going, or parents and people with type 1 diabetes in the family are restricting carbohydrates down to about 50 grams per day. And a ketogenic diet is about 20 grams per day. So I just thought I'd show you what 50 grams of carbohydrate looks like. And this is what some people with type 1 diabetes are trying to follow. And this would be their daily consumption. So it's 3 breads, one of these things, not all of them. Each of these pictures that you see here represents 50 grams of carbohydrate. So it's not a lot. And it's quite a challenging diet to follow, although very popular for people who are trying to lose weight. So what's important really is not, you don't really have to restrict your carbohydrate intake to that low level to get good glycemic control. You really need to look at the types of carbohydrates that you're ingesting. And glycemic index is the rate at which a carbohydrate-rich food is converted to blood sugar. And there are high GI foods and low GI foods, and the foods that are converted very quickly put a strain on the body's systems, and those that are converted more slowly give, I suppose, a more undulating rise in blood sugar levels. And we're obviously, as dietitians, encouraging people to have more of the low GI foods. So and a lot of the high GI foods are not very nutritious anyway, with the exception of rice, for example, watermelon. There are some fruits and grains, refined grains, that will give you a high spike. So what we're really looking at now is actually the glycemic load. So even if you had only a small amount of watermelon, which is a high GI food, that would have probably less impact than eating a very large amount of Basmati rice, for example, or having orange juice made from 7 oranges. So it comes back to not only the type of carbohydrate, but how much you have. So I suppose what is the best practice? Once again, the Mediterranean style of eating is really what is recommended for people with diabetes. It's really no different from what we recommend for every Australian, and it's an emphasis on whole foods that are nutrient rich. And of course, the difference with people with diabetes is carbohydrates and how much you have. And obviously, it's choosing the right carbohydrates and nutritious carbohydrates and fairly evenly distributing them throughout the day to accommodate, to even out your blood glucose levels. And of course, the amount of carbohydrate that you have will vary depending on how active you are, how much exercise you do, and your own energy requirements. So I think just my last slide is really to highlight that rather than getting fixated on all of these numbers, and whether you're looking at glycemic index, glycemic load, blood glucose levels, etc., it's terribly important to, and for practitioners specifically, to focus on the whole person. So take into account eating is so important in our lives, and it's very important to have a healthy relationship with foods. If we unnecessarily restrict important nutritious foods like carbohydrates in our diet, then this can really build an unhealthy relationship with food and cause other issues. So I think it's important to focus on the whole person. We need to look after our gut microbiome. We need to look after our anxiety levels. We need to look after our brain function and every other organ in our body, and make sure that we are vital and have great energy levels. So I think it's important that everyone who has type 1 diabetes sees a dietitian for personalised and precision nutrition advice. So I'll leave it right there. That's a very quick snapshot. And I'd like to now take some of your questions to Tom, that you'd like to ask Tom, and if there are any for me, I'll try and answer those as well. Tom, I'm sorry we lost you a little bit before, but hopefully you had more or less finished your what you wanted to say, but otherwise people will pick up on that.
Hopefully, I'm not sure when you lost me, but yeah, hopefully I think got close to the end. Yep.
Thank you. Now, are there any questions? I have a question, Tom, which was which was really asking you about some of the environmental factors that could actually have an impact on people people developing type 1 diabetes. And the question related to the hygiene hypothesis. I mean, are we, it's an autoimmune condition, are we in an environment where we're just living too cleanly? And specifically now with COVID, where we're sanitizing madly, are you expecting to see a rise in the incidence of type 1 diabetes?
Yes, it's a great question. Are we expecting to see a rise or a fall in the incidence of type 1 diabetes? I just sent an email this morning to a colleague asking about this. So, what happens in diabetes is that people are born with a genetic predisposition. So it's strongly genetic, although it's genetic in a complicated way, so that the vast majority of people who are born with diabetes don't have a close relative with diabetes. Those certainly some do. And then there are definitely environmental modifiers, because if you've got genetically identical twins, if one's got diabetes, there's about a 50-50 chance that the other will get diabetes. It's not 100%. If you've got genetically identical twins where one twin's got type 2 diabetes, then there's nearly a 100% chance that the other twin will get diabetes. That's a very strongly genetically determined disease. There've been many things postulated as being environmental factors in type 1 diabetes, and none of these have really proven to be compelling. Early introduction of cow's milk diets, the amount of sunlight exposure, time of weaning, use of exposure to certain sort of drugs and so on. Certainly a lot of interest about the role of infections. And as Karen mentioned, this idea that the hygiene hypothesis could be involved. Now, there's evidence that both the hygiene hypothesis could be involved, hygiene could be involved. That is, if you live in a very clean environment, for example, in Finland, there's a very clean environment. No one eats their sandwiches with their hands in Finland. They all eat them with a knife and fork. And so the idea is that in those Scandinavian populations, maybe the high levels of hygiene have contributed to their high frequency of diabetes. But no one really knows that for sure. And with the COVID epidemic, it's interesting. There have been a few cases where it looks like COVID might have actually triggered diabetes. There's some increasing number of cases in the literature, and you'll see actually Paul Zimmet in the media talking quite a lot about that at present. And the main trial of looking at these environmental factors in Australia, called the India study, being done by very good close colleagues of ours, Jenny Cooper in Adelaide and Len Harrison in Melbourne. That's going to have an interesting opportunity to sort of say, in this period when kids are being exposed to almost no infections at all because they're at home, not being exposed to the rough and tumble of childhood, and as Karen said, a lot of disinfecting of surfaces, will that increase or decrease the frequency of diabetes? I think that's going to be a very interesting opportunity to study that.
Thanks, Tom. We've got quite a few other questions. There's another question. This is from the questioner. I was diagnosed with type 1 45 years ago as a 5-year-old. I remember at the time my doctor, John Court, would tell me there was a cure just around the corner, and that by the time I was 10, it would be here. As I got older, he obviously would revise the date, but adamant that a cure was close. Would it be fair to say, as now I am a 50-year-old, I won't live to see a cure? Perhaps better systems of maintenance, but not a cure. What's your advice?
Well, I mean, I've been involved in type 1 diabetes nearly as much as the questioner, nearly as long as the questioner has, although not from the same perspective. And I certainly remember interacting a lot with John Court when I was a medical student and so on. He's an absolute doyen of Australian diabetes care. And look, I'm in the same position as the questioner. People have been telling me since I was a resident that the cure for diabetes was just around the corner too. So I feel exactly the same as they do. I do think there's a palpable, there's a real air of excitement right now because couple of drugs I mentioned, teplizumab, the anti-TNF drug, an anti-TNF drug called golimumab that Johnson & Johnson have done trials of, JAK inhibitor trial and so on. I think that there will be, if not a cure, I think that endocrinologists will actually be writing prescriptions for drugs like these, drugs that act on the immune system, act on the mechanisms of diabetes in the next, several years. Because we'll come back to why it's taken so long, but I do think that our discipline of endocrinology needs to prepare itself, not just for saying these things will come in the future, but for actually getting right into writing drugs, just as the rheumatologists have changed their practice to write prescriptions for these kind of drugs for rheumatoid arthritis. That is coming in type 1 diabetes, and so are some stem cell treatments. So I think that who knows exactly the time frame, but I think that we are living in a different era where, rather than being theoretical, and that 5 years thing is always used as a sort of shorthand, it really is coming, and we need to prepare ourselves for that happening. I think people really dramatically underestimated a few things: the complexity of the disease, but also issues around risk aversiveness of the community and so on. It's a very high bar for introducing a new therapy for a disease that primarily affects children, and that's another thing. It might well be that we'll say, well, how come we didn't try some of the drugs that were around 30 years ago? And that might have led to some traumatic impacts. They were tried a bit, but people felt that the side effects were too great. And that's been addressed in large part. We'll be interested to see what happens next.
Now, Tom, we have quite a few questions. I know we won't be able to get to them all.
I'll try and keep them short, my answers brief. Yes.
There's a lot of interest. This is a question relating to two granddaughters, aged 10 and 12, who have celiac disease. The 11-year-old was just diagnosed in June with type 1 diabetes. Is there any connection between the two conditions, and is the 10-year-old likely now to develop type 1 diabetes?
Yes, okay. So there's terrific questions. And like I was saying, okay, so we'll handle the type 1 diabetes is the other granddaughter likely to get type 1 diabetes. So there's an increased risk of that, that's for sure. But the increased risk is about tenfold over the general population, but that means that the risk is about 5%. So there's about a 95% chance that the other child will not develop diabetes. And there are now good ways to work out whether the other child will get diabetes ahead of time, which can prevent that other child from getting sick, can enable the medical team to see that coming and prevent the child from getting sick at the time of diagnosis. It is possible to get tested for the possibility that diabetes will happen in the future. And even more importantly, there are increasingly clinical trials of prevention to prevent the other child getting diabetes if they looked as if they were at risk. Is there a connection between celiac disease and type 1 diabetes? Yes, there's a close connection, primarily related to the shared genetics, which are mainly, in the case of celiac, the overlap between celiac disease and type 1 diabetes, mainly Celtic, actually Northern European and Celtic genes. And yes, there is an increased risk. There's not a completely direct connection, but they are very similar disease processes with this genetic connection. Very happy to take up these sort of conversations offline as well when they relate to specific cases.
Let's just take one more question to you, Tom. The questions related to diet I will answer offline, but there's another one related to gut as well. Are there any studies being done linking gut health problems in children at an early age leading to type 1 as teenagers? And also, are there any links between anxiety and type 1?
Sure. So the first question, yes, I should mention that in the environmental factors, people are very interested in the impact of the microbiome. And again, there's some data from Scandinavia showing that certain microbiome make up makes you more likely to develop type 1 diabetes. A lot of research going on in that area, including in the India study. Is there a connection between anxiety and the development of type 1 diabetes? Let's go down the well, on one hand, let's never underestimate the connection between mental health and brain health and body health. There's always connections there, and they're always important. But in the case of anxiety and type 1 diabetes, they're not particularly direct. And I'd say you could make a case that this is a sort of biological process where there's little evidence that anxiety would contribute to development of type 1 diabetes.
Okay, there's just a quick question for me this time. It's about Basmati versus brown rice. Is one better for you than the other? Well, Basmati has brown rice has a higher GI than Basmati rice, and Basmati rice is white. So it's one of 6 and half a dozen of the other, or whatever the expression is. I think they're both very good. I mean, if you prefer to have a Basmati rice, it is lower in GI, but brown rice has more nutritional value because it's higher in fibre. So I think both are quite suitable for people with diabetes. Tom, there are so many more questions. I think we'll have to leave it there, but would you be prepared to answer some of them offline by email?
Sure, of course.
That might be because there are some, and we just really haven't got time, and I know that people have to go. So
yeah, very happy to answer them. If people, yes, there's some goodies there. So very happy to answer them. Yes, absolutely, and thanks for everybody for their interest.
Yes, well, that's right. And thank you, Tom, very much for speaking to us today. So we'll try and get answers to your questions within a week. This was our final webinar of this Food Matters series for 2020. And from your feedback, it's worked quite well. Maybe this is the way we'll do it in the future. Who knows? But we really thank you very much for joining us. You've been amazing with all your questions today. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. But if you would like to join our mailing list to receive some information about the research that we're doing at SVI, or you'd like to support some of the research that we're doing at SVI, we would absolutely love to hear from you. And please feel free to contact Kate Barnett at the foundation at svi.edu.au, and of course we're always happy. I'm always happy to speak to anybody at any time. So thank you very much. Enjoy. The numbers are good for COVID today, so hopefully we'll be out of lockdown soon. But anyway, thank you very much, and keep.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you.
Everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.